A plain white envelope arrived at Kensington Palace, unmarked, untraceable, and utterly devastating. What lay inside shattered Kate Middleton's world and rewrote royal history forever. It looked harmless at first, just another folded piece of correspondence delivered with the morning's stack of royal briefings and ceremonial invites. But something about this envelope felt eerily wrong. Its wax seal was thick and deep red, unfamiliar and heavy, without the usual royal crest. The handwriting across its front was slanted, deliberate, and far from the polished script of palace staff. Kate hesitated, her fingers brushing over the strange surface with growing unease. It wasn't the sort of caution bred from curiosity. It was instinct. A silent warning rang somewhere deep within her. For a moment, she considered setting it aside, brushing it off as a misdelivered document. But something about it pulled at her, an invisible hand urging her not to look away. And so, heart thudding, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No note, no explanation. Just an official-looking document, crisp and chilling. Across the top, in bold black letters, "Confidential DNA report." The paper trembled in her grasp before her eyes had even moved past the heading. Her breath caught. And then names. Names she knew. Diana Spencer. And another. A name she didn't recognize but would never forget again. Her eyes scanned the clinical lines of genetic data and cold scientific terminology, each word slicing through her thoughts like shards of ice. The phrasing was cold, dispassionate, but the implication thundered through her bones. The results confirmed a match, a connection, a truth that had never been meant to surface. She read it again, and again. Her hands began to shake violently. Her knees weakened. And before she knew it, her body had folded into the nearest chair. The report clutched to her chest, as though she could crush it into dust and erase what it said. But the truth wouldn't fade. It screamed at her in silence, clawing its way into her mind. Her fingers trembled, her chest heaved, and without realizing it, her face was wet. Tears spilled, not just from shock, but from grief, confusion, betrayal, emotions colliding with the weight of a secret too massive to hold alone. The quiet of the room mocked her. Somewhere down the hall, she heard her children laughing, playing in blissful ignorance while she sat still, broken. Her thoughts darted like frightened birds, crashing into memories she'd long dismissed, sideways glances from Charles during family dinners, strange silences when Diana's name came up, and whispers from staff over the years that she'd always chalked up to gossip. But now everything makes sense, or rather, now everything makes less sense than ever. This wasn't just a revelation, it was a rupture. A violent split between the reality she thought she knew and the history the monarchy had buried. And the more she tried to make sense of it, the more she realized this discovery wasn't some isolated secret from a tragic past. It was a puzzle piece one Diana had hidden in plain sight. A piece Kate was never meant to find. But now she has. And nothing could undo what she had just read. But as the weight of Diana's secret crushed Kate's breath, she realized this wasn't just about the past. It was a blueprint for the future she was never meant to see. Diana had tried to warn them. Now Kate finally saw the truth buried in her late mother-in-law's haunting final letters, coded messages meant only for the woman brave enough to find them. The DNA report still gripped in her hand. Kate's mind drifted to memories she had long buried, moments that had once seemed harmless, even sentimental. There had been a diary. Not just one, but several, locked away behind glass during a public exhibition at Althorp. Back then, the pages were presented as poetic relics from a princess lost too soon. But now, those same words rang with an eerie urgency. One entry in particular echoed with chilling clarity. "She will know when she is ready." At the time, Kate had smiled gently at the phrasing, imagining it was a message for William or even a metaphor for healing. But now, the meaning had shifted, sharpened, and embedded itself deep in her chest. Diana hadn't been waxing poetic, she had been speaking directly to her. Suddenly, the scattered pieces of Diana's veiled life began pulling together. Whispers from palace staff, fragments of forgotten interviews, and brief anecdotes from Charles himself, all things Kate had once brushed aside, now revealed themselves as breadcrumbs. Diana had always spoken in layered truths, cloaking her fears in metaphor, wrapping her warnings in gentleness, because saying them plainly would have been too dangerous. One such letter, hidden in an archive of correspondence with a now-forgotten confidant, hinted at a discovery made late in Diana's marriage, one so explosive it could destroy the illusion of blood. The letter was dismissed at the time, its phrases too vague to hold weight, but now, after what Kate had just uncovered, its meaning was inescapable. More than once, Diana referred to the monarchy not as a family, but a machine that demanded obedience and silence, one that swallowed individual pain to keep its gears turning. It had been an unnerving metaphor, one Kate never fully understood until now. She saw it all with new eyes. The polished image, the structured rituals, the cold glances exchanged behind royal smiles. Diana's every warning had been about what they were willing to hide to keep the crown untarnished. And now, Kate realized, she wasn't stumbling into this truth by accident. She had been led to it. Suddenly, memories of tense conversations with Charles replayed with fresh venom. Once, over tea, he had warned her not to dig too deep into the past, advice delivered with a calm exterior but an unmistakable edge. Kate had written it off as overprotectiveness, but now it sounded like a warning, perhaps even a threat. And as she stared at the report in her hand, Diana's words ringing louder with each breath, the sense of purpose settled over her like armor. This was never about her just being a wife, a duchess, or even a future queen. She had been chosen, whether by fate or Diana herself, to finish what the Princess of Wales had started. The question was no longer if the secret was real. It was why it had been buried so deeply. And who else had known? Kate's grief was no longer just for Diana. It was for every silent scream, every buried truth, every piece of herself that had been molded to fit the monarchy's ideal. She wasn't just mourning the past anymore. She was preparing for war. Haunted by Diana's words, Kate knew there was only one place where the rest of the truth could be hiding within the walls where Diana once walked, cried, and hid her final fears. Deep inside the Spencer estate, behind dust-covered doors, Kate found the archive no one dared touch. What Diana left behind was not nostalgia, it was a weapon. The trip to Althorp had been quietly arranged, cloaked in vague excuses and diplomatic language. Officially, it was framed as a much-needed retreat, a moment of pause away from the relentless public eye. But in truth, Kate wasn't seeking peace, she was hunting ghosts. Not the kind that haunted halls, but the kind that lived in locked drawers and sealed boxes. As the black iron gates of the estate closed behind her, she wasn't just stepping into Diana's childhood home. She was walking into the only place that might still hold the unfiltered truth. Althorp was sacred ground, not just for history, but for secrets. And Kate had come to excavate them. She said little upon arrival, keeping her composure fixed and her schedule ambiguous. But when night fell and most of the staff had retired, she made her move. A discreet word with an aging housekeeper, someone who had once served Diana with quiet devotion, was all it took. The woman hesitated, eyes narrowing as though weighing the risks, but something in Kate's expression softened her resolve. With a slow nod, she led Kate through a part of the estate few remembered and even fewer dared to enter. A long, narrow corridor stretched into silence, ending at a door so forgotten its brass handle was almost fused by time. The housekeeper didn't follow. She simply placed a trembling hand on the doorframe and whispered, "She always said you'd come." Behind the door, the air was heavy, old, and untouched, like time had held its breath for decades. Shelves lined with aging boxes and neatly stacked files filled the room, but it was the small cluster in the far corner that drew Kate's attention. Tied with faded ribbons and labeled in Diana's unmistakable hand, the words sent a jolt down her spine. "For Catherine, when the time is right." That time was now. She opened the first box with deliberate care, as though tearing through the past too quickly might undo her. Inside, letter after letter, written in an unsteady confessional tone, spilled out like the cry of a woman desperate to preserve the truth before it was stolen. Diana's handwriting danced with urgency, recounting secret meetings, unexplained absences, and coded references to a man she trusted more than any within the palace walls. There were photos, tucked carefully between the pages, grainy, faded, and clandestine. A man stood beside Diana in multiple frames, never quite centered, always at the edges, but always present. His face was unfamiliar, his presence unmistakably intimate. There was a closeness in their posture that no lens could fake. And then came the final blow, a sealed envelope marked simply, DNA. Kate's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, documents mirrored the ones she had already seen. Same language, same conclusion. This wasn't some rogue scientist or accidental discovery. Diana had known. She had sought proof, and she had left it behind not just as evidence but as a warning. This archive wasn't a diary. It was a dossier, and its implications were explosive. But what chilled Kate wasn't just what Diana wrote, it was who she wrote about. And his face would shatter everything she thought she knew about the royal bloodline. Diana had a secret companion, a shadowy figure erased from official records, but forever immortalized in hidden photos, and his resemblance to someone very familiar was terrifying. The photographs Kate found in the box were not posed, not staged, not the kind you'd expect from a woman under constant surveillance. They were candid, intimate, captured with trembling hands and hidden lenses. The man who appeared beside Diana in frame after frame was a mystery in every sense. Tall, composed, slightly detached in his posture, but always watching her with an unmistakable protectiveness. His face was foreign, and yet, not entirely. There was something in the shape of his eyes, the curve of his cheekbones, the defiant set of his jaw. It was a face that bore the weight of belonging and not belonging, a face that shouldn't exist in this context but did. And when Kate stared at it long enough, the resemblance began to claw at her memory. Not to William, not even to Charles, but to Harry. Not the Harry of today, but an older, weathered, distant, haunted version. The likeness was too sharp to ignore. And the more Kate read, the worse it became. Diana's letters and those hurried confessions spoke of this man in cryptic terms. She never named him directly, but her tone changed whenever he was mentioned. Her guarded sarcasm, her biting humor, her public weariness, they all vanished in favor of something softer. Her writing turned protective, almost maternal, and then, at times, shockingly romantic. She described late-night conversations, whispered fears, secrets exchanged in borrowed moments. One sentence pierced straight through Kate's composure. "He carries more of me than anyone knows, and because of that, they will never allow him to exist." The message wasn't hidden. It was practically screaming. Suddenly, the implications turned sharper than any knife. This wasn't just a companion. This wasn't some fleeting friendship forged in the vacuum of royal misery. Diana had protected him deliberately, passionately, and now it was becoming harder to deny what those in the deepest corners of the monarchy had feared for years, that Diana had left behind more than a legacy. She had left behind blood. The suggestion of secret paternity hovered over every word, heavy and undeniable. And the fact that this man had vanished from every public trace, scrubbed from the press, the archives, even the whispered annals of court gossip only reinforced the truth. Kate's pulse raced as she laid the photographs side by side with the DNA report. Her world tilted again. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a conspiracy. This prophecy was fulfilled. One that Diana had known would never be spoken aloud, not until the right person, someone with the courage and position, forced it into the light. And that person was her. Armed with Diana's warnings and this man's identity, Kate knew she had to confront the one person who might confirm the impossible and had the most to lose. Behind closed palace doors, Kate finally confronted Charles, and when she read Diana's words aloud, the king's mask slipped and the truth spilled like poison. She chose her moment with surgical precision. No aides, no staff, no official business to interrupt or distract. Just the two of them, Kate and the king, separated by years of protocol but now united by a secret that threatened to detonate the monarchy from within. Kate entered the room not as the Duchess of Cambridge or the future queen consort, but as a woman armed with undeniable proof and decades of silenced pain. Charles sat poised, his expression unreadable. The weight of the crown perched so tightly on his shoulders it seemed fused to his skin. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She laid the photographs, the letters, the DNA report down in front of him, one after the other like evidence in a trial he never thought he'd have to face. His hands didn't move. His eyes flicked downward, scanning briefly before he leaned back with a dry, unimpressed sigh. "Conspiracies," he muttered. "Diana's old delusions." But Kate wasn't here to be dismissed. She opened one of Diana's letters and began to read, her voice steady, her fury disguised in each measured syllable. As Diana's words filled the room, as her confessions clawed their way back into the palace through the daughter-in-law who had found them, something shifted in Charles's demeanor. The tightness in his jaw loosened. His eyes dropped for just a second too long. And Kate saw it. The crack. The fault line beneath his carefully curated indifference. He was no longer pretending he hadn't read those words before he was preparing for what came next. It didn't take long. When she reached the passage about the man they erased, Charles exhaled in a sound that was more defeat than denial. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply closed his eyes and said, yes, he was real. The air thickened, charged with the enormity of his confession. He spoke slowly, as if each word weighed 1,000 pounds. He confirmed the man's existence, his closeness to Diana, and the quiet pact forged by those who believed protecting the institution was more important than revealing the truth. Documents were buried, mentions erased, and over time, the silence became policy. It wasn't done to hurt her, he said flatly. It was done to preserve the institution. But that justification, so cold and mechanical, struck Kate like a slap. She rose from her chair, eyes burning, voice breaking as she tore through the final veil of royal diplomacy. "You let her die under the weight of a secret she begged someone to carry," she shouted. "You let her drown while you polished the image of the crown." Her words didn't just accuse them. She spoke for every moment Diana had been called unstable, for every time she'd been dismissed as fragile when she was, in truth, screaming to be heard. And now, standing here, Kate realized she had become part of the same machinery until now. Charles didn't fight back. He didn't explain further. His silence was louder than any defense. And for the first time, Kate saw him not as a ruler, not as her father-in-law, but as a man who had made a choice, not one of ignorance, but of complicity. A man who had watched the woman he once loved unravel in public, while privately working to ensure that the secret she carried would never see the light. As Charles sat in cold silence, Kate saw him not as a monarch, but as a man who chose power over truth. But now, William had to choose too. When Kate placed the DNA report before William, she expected shock, but what she got was silence, and a tear that said he'd always known something was wrong. She waited until the house was quiet, until the sounds of their children laughing in the corridors faded into the soft rhythm of bedtime. Only then did she gather the documents, her hands still trembling from the confrontation with Charles, and walk into the room where William sat, unaware that his entire world was about to tilt. He greeted her with a tired smile, but it vanished the moment he saw her face. She said nothing at first, just placed the envelope on the table between them and stepped back. William stared at it like it might explode, hesitant to reach for what he somehow knew could unravel the only version of his family he'd ever trusted. He picked it up slowly, fingers tracing the edges of the pages. His eyes moved across the lines, Diana's name, the lab stamp, the results, and his entire posture changed. The blood drained from his face, his shoulders tightened, and then, silence. But it wasn't the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of a man finally staring down the ghost that had always lingered just beyond the reach of his memory. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, a single tear slid down his cheek, a silent confirmation of something buried for too long. When he finally spoke, it wasn't denial, it was a memory. He talked about Diana's late-night visits to his room as a child, her whispered fears, her tight embraces that always lingered longer than they should have. He remembered her warning him not to trust appearances, her cryptic statements about a truth no one will protect unless you do. At the time, they seemed like the ramblings of a heartbroken woman. Now, they were instructions. Then came the anger, not loud, not violent, but steady, consuming. Anger at his father for allowing this secret to rot beneath the palace floors. Anger at the monarchy for demanding his silence in exchange for survival. And most painfully, anger at himself for never asking more questions, for never pressing when Diana's eyes pleaded for someone to just listen. The betrayal didn't just sit on his tongue, it poisoned everything he thought he understood about loyalty, legacy, and truth. And then Harry entered his thoughts. His younger brother, the black sheep, the one who had always felt out of place, dismissed, misunderstood. William saw it now through a new lens. What if Harry's defiance had never been rebellion but intuition? What if the rage Harry carried wasn't about the institution itself, but about the unspoken truth vibrating beneath their feet? Suddenly, William wasn't just grieving his mother. He was grieving a lifetime of lies. Kate moved closer, placed a hand over his, and whispered the words that refused to let him hide any longer. "Don't let Diana's truth die with us." Her voice cracked, but her eyes were fierce. She wasn't begging. She was invoking a promise. But just as William wrestled with duty and love, a voice from the shadows emerged, one that had survived in silence and was ready to strike. Camila didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her threat came with a smile and a whisper that if Kate spoke, everything she loved would burn with her. The knock never came. Camila didn't ask permission. She simply appeared in the doorway of Kate's private quarters like a shadow that had always been there, waiting. Her presence was quiet, unnerving. A figure molded by decades of survival within palace walls, now wielding silence like a sword. Kate had barely processed William's breakdown when she looked up and saw Camila standing there, unbothered, uninvited. The queen consort stepped in as if she owned the room, as if this moment was hers to orchestrate. And from the glint in her eye, Kate realized it was. "I heard you've been busy," Camila said softly, almost kindly. She didn't ask. She stated. And then she sat, unhurried, crossing her legs with the casual grace of a woman who had spent her life perfecting the art of menace through charm. She glanced at the papers on Kate's desk, the DNA reports, the photographs, the letters, and offered a knowing nod. "You found him," she said, as if discussing the weather. And just like that, the game was exposed. She had known all along. What followed wasn't a denial or even a defense. It was a masterclass in quiet control. Camila spoke of choices, of the brutal arithmetic required to survive within the royal machine. She admitted without hesitation that she had discovered Diana's secret years ago, that she had used it not to destroy, but to bargain, to ascend, to secure her place beside Charles in a throne room that had once belonged, at least in spirit, to someone else. "Power," she said, "isn't about truth. It's about what you can keep hidden." Then came the warning, casual, clinical, and laced with venom. If Kate dared to speak publicly, the monarchy wouldn't be the only casualty. Camila leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate, almost motherly. She referenced Kate's own family, her parents' modest beginnings, her sister's public scrutiny, her own children's reputations. She brought up William not with concern, but calculation. "A scandal of this scale," she whispered, "it wouldn't just ruin the firm. It would ruin you." And then, the final blow, delivered with a thin smile. "The press is always hungry. Don't feed them yourself." Kate sat still, every muscle coiled, her face a portrait of royal restraint. But inside, a storm raged. Camilla's words didn't frighten her, they ignited her. Because now it was clear, this wasn't about a family secret. It was about a war Diana had fought alone, a war Camila had capitalized on, and now, a war Kate had no choice but to finish. She let Camila finish her veiled threats, letting her revel in the illusion of control. But behind Kate's poised expression was something far more dangerous than fear conviction. But what Camila underestimated was the one thing that now gave Kate power: Diana's ghost. And her voice was about to rise louder than ever before. As cameras rolled and the world watched, Kate defied centuries of silence. Her tears weren't weakness, they were war cries, and she held the monarchy's final secret in her hands. She had no official sanction, no approval from palace advisors, no carefully drafted statements from Buckingham's communications team. What Kate did that morning, she did alone. By dawn, whispers had already begun word of a surprise announcement, a private press gathering, journalists called at the last minute with no explanation, but the kind of urgency that hinted at history in the making. As they assembled outside Kensington, cameras ready, they didn't know what they were about to witness. But when Kate stepped forward, her hands clutching a slim folder and her face streaked with quiet determination, the air changed. She didn't begin with titles. She didn't mention protocol. She didn't speak like a duchess. She spoke like a woman who had carried the unbearable weight of another woman's truth and who had finally decided to set it free. Her voice shook at first, trembled beneath the pressure of emotion, but she didn't stop. With each word, her strength grew, as if Diana herself stood beside her, lending courage. Kate told the world what the palace had worked for decades to keep hidden. She spoke of the letters, the photographs, the archive buried deep within Althorp's forgotten corridors. She detailed the pattern of silencing, the veil of deception, and the system that had protected a crown at the expense of a mother's legacy. Then she held up the report of the DNA confirmation that proved Diana had a third child, one whose name had never been spoken aloud, one who had been erased before he could ever be claimed. The shock was immediate. Gasps, camera shutters, reporters fumbling to catch every word. But Kate pressed on. She did not name the man. She did not reveal where he was or who had helped hide him. She simply said what needed to be said. Diana's final secret was no longer a secret, and the monarchy, as the world knew it, would never be the same again. The emotional fallout was volcanic. Within minutes, headlines exploded across every media outlet on Earth. Social platforms lit up in flames. Diana's final secret began trending before her statement was even complete. The support came like a tidal wave. Public figures, journalists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens all raised their voices in stunned solidarity. Some expressed outrage, others mourned for what had been stolen. But all agreed on one thing. This was a reckoning long overdue. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Phones rang endlessly, aides scrambled, crisis meetings were called behind locked doors. The institution had been blindsided by the one woman they thought they could keep in line. Kate didn't flinch. But when it was over, when her final words echoed through the courtyard and the cameras finally stopped flashing, her composure gave way. She turned to William, who had stood just out of frame, and collapsed into his arms, sobbing not from weakness, but from the unbearable relief of no longer carrying someone else's silence. And yet, just as the world reeled, the final player emerged, stepping into the light, calm, solemn, and carrying the burden of a bloodline denied. He didn't ask for a crown, but the moment he said her name, the world changed. Diana's son had finally come forward, and the monarchy would never be the same. For days, the public buzzed with speculation. News outlets dissected Kate's confession frame by frame, every word analyzed, every breath measured. And in the eye of this media storm, one question eclipsed all others. Who was he? The man Diana had hidden, the man the palace had erased, the man whose existence now loomed over centuries of royal tradition. And then, just when the speculation reached a fever pitch, he stepped forward. No palace gate, no red carpet, no pageantry. Just a quiet press conference arranged without royal endorsement, held on neutral ground. A podium, a nameplate, and a presence that felt impossible to ignore. He didn't speak with anger. He didn't demand revenge. He began by thanking Kate, not as a royal, but as a woman who had risked everything to honor his mother's memory. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent his entire life in the shadows, not by choice, but by necessity. And as he spoke of Diana, he didn't refer to her as the Princess of Wales or a public figure. He called her Mum. The word hit like lightning. He said he had remained hidden for as long as he could bear, not to protect himself, but to protect her. He had promised himself that her suffering would not be turned into spectacle. But now that the truth had been revealed, he could no longer allow her legacy to be distorted by silence. He spoke of an upbringing shaped by whispers, fragmented truths, and the haunting knowledge that he was a living secret. He revealed little about his guardians, even less about his location, but what he did share was enough. The years spent avoiding cameras, dodging questions, watching from afar as two brothers unknowingly carried the public version of a story he knew was incomplete. His pain wasn't theatrical, it was precise, quiet, and devastatingly real. But what changed the world wasn't just his confession. It was the moment he looked into the camera, his jaw steady, and said, "They told me I had no place, but blood cannot be erased." He never named the monarchy. He didn't have to. The implication was seismic. He wasn't seeking titles or crowns. He wasn't asking to be brought into the fold. He was demanding recognition not for himself, but for Diana, for what she endured, for what she died protecting. The room fell silent. The statement ended. But the world had already shifted. Public reaction was instant and polarized. Millions rallied behind him, calling him a symbol of suppressed truth. Others recoiled, fearful of what this meant for succession, for tradition, for the very fabric of royal identity. Protests erupted outside Buckingham. Petitions launched overnight. Polls swung. Headlines turned brutal. And through it all, the man himself disappeared once again, slipping back into silence after delivering the blow no palace wall could contain. And somewhere, standing far from the cameras, Kate watched it all unfold. Her hand rested on her stomach, not in fear but in resolve. She had done what Diana had only dreamed of. She had shattered the silence. And now, with a new generation growing within her, she made an unspoken vow: never again would the truth be buried to protect a crown. And with that, the palace gates closed, but this time, not to bury a secret, but to prepare for a reckoning. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.